Jody Bordeaux was a 28-year-old pregnant woman whose life was cut tragically short. When she accepted what seemed to be a routine job, little did she know that she was entering into a high-stakes situation that would rapidly spiral out of control. She and her husband, Sean Bordeaux, had married in 1995 and settled into a small farmhouse on the Kickapoo Indian Reservation in Powhatan, Kansas. Sean was Lakota Sioux, while Jody herself was not Native American. The couple moved to Kansas for an opportunity to help manage the new Golden Eagle Casino. This casino was the first Native-owned casino in the area and promised to bring millions in revenue and jobs to the local Kickapoo tribe. By 1997, Jody's life seemed to be falling into place. She had a loving marriage, a promising career, and after several miscarriages, she was finally pregnant with her first child. At work, Jody's dedication had earned her a promotion to slot machine department staff supervisor, a role that put her in charge of overseeing casino employees. Colleagues described Jody as hardworking and capable, someone who took her responsibilities seriously. Part of her job was to evaluate employee performance and report misconduct or poor performance to the Kickapoo Tribal Council, which had final say in disciplinary actions. Sean, who worked alongside her, was proud of Jody's accomplishments. However, not everyone was happy about Jody's rapid rise through the ranks. Many staff members resented that two outsiders, Sean from another tribe and Jody from no tribe at all, held high positions at the casino. As contemporary reports put it, having outsiders holding significant sway over the operation rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. Essentially, they were seen as complete outsiders who had no issue reporting any supposed discrepancies in the casino to the tribal council. Still, in late 1997, Jody remained optimistic. She was excelling in her career and eagerly awaiting the birth of her daughter, whom she planned to name Jordan Shea. Despite Jody's positive outlook, trouble was brewing at work. One of the employees she supervised became a major source of conflict. This particular staffer frequently showed up late, had a poor attitude, and openly disliked answering to Jody. Fulfilling her duties, Jody documented the issues and reported him. The tribal casino board responded by reprimanding the employee and putting him on probation for his behavior. Rather than improve, the employee's conduct worsened until he was eventually fired from the casino. That dismissal didn't end the bad blood. In fact, it seemed to inflame it. A few weeks after being let go, the disgruntled ex-employee filed a formal grievance against Jody, accusing her of habitual tardiness on the job. The accusation had some truth to it. Around that time, Jody had indeed been late to work on several mornings. The reason, however, was not negligence or laziness, but rather, she was undergoing medical treatments related to her pregnancy. Jody always made up the time by staying late on those days, and her husband backed up her explanation. Unfortunately, the nuance didn't matter. In what Jody's husband felt was an act of vengeance, the tribal council took the grievance at face value and fired Jody from her supervisor position. It was a shocking blow. Within a short span, Jody went from a rising star at the casino to unemployed, all while well into her pregnancy. Jody did not accept her firing quietly, and for the next month she fought to regain her job, petitioning the tribal council to review her case. By mid-November 1997, there were encouraging signs that she might win reinstatement. During one council meeting, members indicated they would consider giving Jody her position back. Word spread around the reservation that Jody Bordeaux might soon return to the casino in a supervisory role. This is a rumor that, in hindsight, may have been deadly. Almost as soon as talk of her comeback began, the Bordeaux household started receiving a string of disturbing anonymous phone calls. The calls were frequent and unnerving, and when Jody answered, the person on the other end would remain silent or abruptly hang up. She confided in her mother, Candace Smith, about these strange calls, sensing that she was being harassed by someone who wanted to frighten her. Jody also had the creeping feeling that someone was watching their home. On several nights, she told Sean she heard noises outside and saw furtive movements in the yard. Sean tried to reassure his wife that it was probably just a raccoon or a coyote lurking in the dark, never imagining it could be something far more sinister. Late on the night of November 20th, 1997, those vague threats became a brutal reality. It was past midnight, into the early moments of November 21st, when Sean and Jody Bordeaux were relaxing in their house after a quiet evening. Jody was already in her pajamas, and the couple's dog suddenly began barking at something outside. The couple paused and ended up going on full alert. It was after 12:30 a.m. and pitch dark on their rural property. Sean got up to see what the dog was fussing about and headed toward the back porch door. In that instant, without warning, a storm of steel began to hail down upon the building. This series of deafening pops and flashes tore through the Bordeaux home. Bullets blasted through the living room window and walls, spraying drywall dust and debris into the air. At first, Sean didn't comprehend what was happening. The first loud pop made him think a light bulb had exploded in the lamp behind his chair. But in the next second, as more shots rang out, Sean realized their house was under attack. He shouted for Jody, and Jody had jumped up from the couch when the shooting began and ran toward the bedroom for cover. Before she could shut the door or escape the line of fire, one of the high-powered rifle rounds ripped through the wall and struck Jody in the head. She collapsed to the floor of the bedroom. In the chaos of the moment, Sean dropped to the ground and crawled after his wife. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the storm of steel ceased. Shakily, Sean made his way to Jody's side and found her lying on the bedroom floor, bleeding and unresponsive. One glance told him the terrible truth. His wife had been slain instantly by the shot to her head. Sean's next thought was of their unborn baby. Jody was 7 months pregnant, and he desperately hoped the child might still be saved. He grabbed the telephone and dialed 911, frantically urging for an ambulance. Within minutes, deputies and EMTs arrived at the remote farmhouse. Sean was distraught, but pointed officers to where his wife lay gravely wounded. Paramedics rushed Jody to a local hospital in a last attempt to save the baby she was carrying, but tragically, it was too late, and neither mother nor child could be saved. The joyful future that had awaited this young family just hours before had been shattered in a hail of bullets. Investigators surveyed a chilling crime scene at the Bordeaux home. Outside in the yard, they found numerous spent shell casings strewn near the house, evidence that the shooter had fired many rounds from just outside the Bordeaux's windows. In the light of police flashlights, multiple bullet holes pockmarked the walls, and shattered glass littered the living room. It appeared the perpetrator had quietly approached the house in the dark, opened fire on the home from outside, and then fled into the night. Sean told officers that after the hail of bullets stopped, he had heard the sound of a vehicle speeding away into the darkness. The attack had the hallmarks of an ambush designed to inflict maximal carnage. There was no sign of burglary or an attempt to enter the house, and the shooter's intent was plainly not robbery. This horrible act against Jody Bordeaux, a young pregnant wife slain on reservation land, posed immediate jurisdictional questions. The attack took place at the Bordeaux's home, which was near the boundary of the Kickapoo Reservation. Sean, in his shock and grief, urged that the FBI get involved, believing a crime on native land would fall under federal jurisdiction. The tribe considered the farmhouse part of the reservation, but due to shifting boundary lines, it was technically just outside tribal land. In the end, federal authorities declined to take the lead, citing jurisdictional limitations, and the case was left in the hands of state and local law enforcement. The Brown County Sheriff's Department was first on the scene, and they promptly called in the Kansas Bureau of Investigation for assistance that same night. Detectives and crime scene analysts combed through the house for evidence, but the nature of the attack left them few clues to go on. The shooter had fired from a distance under cover of darkness, leaving behind only shell casings and footprints that yielded little useful forensic evidence. No weaponry was recovered at or near the scene. From the outset, investigators looked closely at Sean Bordeaux, as is standard procedure when a spouse is slain, but his account held up under scrutiny. Sean's 911 call, his attempts to save Jody, and the lack of any motive on his part led police to rule him out as a suspect early on. And yeah, let's just be honest here. If he was involved, the absolute last thing he would have done is asked for the FBI to get involved. Attention quickly turned toward the casino workplace as the likely nexus of the crime. Jody's recent troubles at the Golden Eagle Casino were well known, and detectives learned about the fired employee who had openly threatened her career. The fact that Jody had been receiving anonymous harassing calls in the weeks before her death was a significant red flag. It suggested this wasn't a random act, such as an attempted robbery gone horrifically wrong, but a targeted hit stemming from an ongoing grudge. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that solving this case would not be easy. Brown County authorities and the KBI interviewed dozens of people, casino staff, local residents, and members of the Kickapoo community, in hopes of finding a witness or informant. But fear and silence pervaded the community. Investigators grew frustrated at the lack of cooperation. According to those familiar with the case, there was long-standing mistrust between the local Native American community and outside law enforcement, which hindered communication. Potential witnesses who might have seen or heard something that night were reluctant to come forward. Some were possibly intimidated by threats. Indeed, several individuals declined to be interviewed for a televised segment about Jody's case after they reportedly received warnings to stay quiet. Authorities feared that people with knowledge of the crime were keeping silent out of loyalty or fear of retribution within the small community. By 2000, nearly 3 years had passed with no arrests. Frustrated by the slow progress, Brown County Attorney Kevin Hill convened an inquest to compel testimony and shake loose new information. Hill said, in reference to the inquiry, that investigators had zeroed in on a few likely perpetrators, but only gave limited details beyond that. These individuals, he noted, were not strangers to Jody, but rather people who had an axe to grind. In other words, the prime suspects were people connected to Jody's work life, exactly what Sean and others had suspected from the beginning. Despite increasing confidence about the who and why behind the act, the proof remained elusive. Investigators simply could not gather enough admissible evidence to file charges. Important witnesses stayed silent, and forensic evidence was scant. By the late 2000s, authorities had privately identified 3 individuals they considered the chief suspects in the act. But without witness cooperation or direct evidence, law enforcement couldn't make a viable case. More than 25 years have now passed since Jody Bordeaux's slaying, and official theories about the case have remained consistent. Investigators are convinced that the motive was retaliation related to Jody's job at the casino. The primary person of interest has long been the former Golden Eagle employee whom Jody disciplined and ultimately helped fire. It's widely believed by law enforcement that this ex-employee didn't act alone. The theory is that he enlisted 1 or 2 accomplices, perhaps friends or family members, to carry out or assist in the assault on the Bordeaux homestead. The crime may have involved a driver and a shooter, or multiple shooters, given the number of shots fired. Notably, the authorities likely know the exact amount of shooters involved, but of course the fact that the investigation is ongoing complicates the release of this information. Investigators have never publicly named these suspects, but they have indicated that all of them were familiar with Jody and had personal beef with her stemming from the workplace. Some who are close to the case feel that the identity of the perpetrator is practically an open secret in the community. They suspect that many locals know or strongly suspect who pulled the trigger, but have stayed silent to protect themselves or their families. Ultimately, even if someone from the community did want to come forward to put those responsible behind bars, this would likely require testifying in court. It's unfortunate that the farmhouse wasn't on reservation property and that the FBI wasn't able to get involved. If the FBI had been involved, they would have had the resources to protect witnesses in a federal case. Local law enforcement simply doesn't have the sort of resources that would be required to guarantee the safety of witnesses in a case such as this. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just reminding you guys to check out the Patreon or the YouTube membership if you want to support my channel further. Also, remember to hit like and subscribe. And also remember to ring the notification bell and turn on all notifications for my channel. Woolly mammoths once roamed across the Ice Age tundra of Europe, Asia, and North America, towering over the prehistoric landscape with their curved tusks and shaggy coats. By around 10,000 years ago, however, these giant herbivores had mostly vanished from the mainland. The world was warming at the end of the last ice age, shrinking the mammoths' favored cold grassland habitat, and human hunters were spreading into their territories. One by one, mammoth populations fell to a combination of climate change and hunting pressure. Yet, against all odds, a tiny population of mammoths found refuge on a remote Arctic island. On Wrangel Island, a small island north of Siberia, mammoths survived for another 6,000 years after their mainland cousins had died out. Incredibly, this means the last Wrangel Island mammoths were still alive around 2000 BC. To put this in perspective, this means these great creatures were walking the earth well after the construction of the Great Pyramids at Giza. In the aftermath of the Ice Age, as glaciers melted and sea levels rose, Wrangel Island was cut off from the mainland. A small herd of mammoths became marooned on this island around 10,000 years ago, when rising seas turned a once-connected coastal plain into an isolated sanctuary. Scientists estimate that perhaps no more than 8 to 10 mammoths initially made up this stranded group. Such a tiny founding population faced a serious genetic bottleneck, but they managed to survive and reproduce. And trust me, the less you think about how these elephant cousins managed to pull this off, the better. Remarkably, within a few hundred years, the Wrangel Island mammoths rebounded from their narrow escape. Their numbers grew to a stable population of about 200 to 300 animals, a sizable herd given the island's limited size. For millennia, these mammoths lived and bred in isolation, wandering the tundra valleys of Wrangel and drinking from its rivers under the northern sky. Free from human interference and predators like large carnivores, they carved out a niche on the island. Their physical size remained similar to mainland woolly mammoths. While they were initially believed to be separate species of dwarf mammoth, subsequent findings indicated a large variation in the size of the animals. This Arctic island enclave became the last stronghold of a species that had otherwise nearly disappeared from the planet. Even as thousands of years passed, the Wrangel Island mammoths continued to persist in their seclusion. They survived long beyond the extinction of mammoths elsewhere, enduring harsh Arctic winters and finding enough sparse vegetation in summer to sustain themselves. For roughly 6,000 years after mammoths vanished from the continents, the island population stayed viable. To put that in perspective, the Wrangel mammoths outlived the Ice Age by many millennia. They were still drinking from Wrangel Island's riverbeds, while the Great Pyramids were being built in Egypt, and stories of Gilgamesh were first being told in Mesopotamia. This extended survival has fascinated scientists and the public alike. How did this small group manage to thrive for so long? And ultimately, what finally caused their demise around 4,000 years ago when their island had kept them safe for so many generations? Around 4,000 years ago, the mammoths of Wrangel Island abruptly disappeared from the fossil record. Their extinction has prompted much scientific detective work, and several leading theories have emerged to explain why these last mammoths died out. In piecing together this prehistoric mystery, researchers have considered factors that affected mammoths elsewhere. One obvious suspect in the mammoths' extinction is climate and habitat change. The world these mammoths inhabited was not static. During the mid-Holocene, the epoch 4,000 to 10,000 years ago, climates continued to warm and environments changed. On the mainland, warming temperatures had transformed the open steppe tundra ecosystem, where mammoths flourished, into boggier tundra and boreal forest. This change led to an environment which supported few of the grasses and herbs the mammoths ate. As the climate gradually warmed, the island might have seen alterations in its plant communities or shorter periods of sea ice that could affect the ecology. However, the key point is that Wrangel's mammoths survived those long-term changes for thousands of years. There's no sign of a slow decline in their population that would indicate they simply dwindled away as their food supply ran out. In fact, genetic studies suggest the population remained stable up until the end. That makes a slow, climate-driven fade-out seem unlikely as the sole cause of extinction. Instead, if climate played a role, it may have been through a more abrupt environmental event. Scientists speculate that an extreme weather episode could have struck the island near the end of the mammoth's tenancy on Wrangel. For example, an unusually severe winter storm or an icy rain-on-snow event might have suddenly locked up the vegetation under ice, leading to mass starvation in a single season. Such climatic disasters are rare, but they can wipe out large numbers of animals very quickly. Elsewhere in the world, human predation is often listed as a prime driver of megafauna extinctions. Stone Age hunters targeted mammoths for meat, skins, and ivory, and archaeological sites across Eurasia and the Americas. On Wrangel Island, however, the scenario appears very different. The isolation that protected the mammoths from outside threats also kept early humans away from Wrangel for a long time. Archaeological evidence indicates that humans didn't reach Wrangel Island until roughly 3,700 years ago, a few centuries after the last mammoth had already died. Moreover, no butchered mammoth remains have been found on Wrangel from before that time. This strongly suggests that unlike their counterparts on the mainland, the Wrangel mammoths were never hunted by humans. Scientists therefore largely rule out overhunting as a cause of the Wrangel Island extinction. Perhaps the most intriguing theory has to do with genetics. When a population is as small and isolated as the Wrangel group, inbreeding is unavoidable. Over generations, inbreeding can lead to an accumulation of harmful genetic mutations, a process sometimes called genomic meltdown. In 2017, researchers sequenced the DNA from a Wrangel Island mammoth and found signs that the population's genetic health had indeed suffered by the end. The Wrangel mammoth's genome contained a number of detrimental mutations and missing genes. Many of the mammoth's olfactory receptor genes, important for smell, were non-functional, and genes related to social signaling via scent were damaged. One gene affecting hair texture was broken, which might even have given the last mammoths unusually silky coats. The idea was that by 4,000 years ago, the mammoth's fertility had been compromised by inbreeding and mutation accumulation, dooming the herd. However, newer research has complicated this picture, which had previously been widely accepted. In 2024, a team of scientists analyzed genomes from 21 different mammoths, including many from Wrangel Island, spanning its thousands of years of habitation. What they found was surprising. Despite the expected inbreeding and reduced genetic diversity, the Wrangel population seemed demographically healthy for most of its time on the island. The genetic diversity of the island mammoths did drop sharply when the group was first isolated. But after that initial bottleneck, the population expanded and maintained a roughly steady size of a few hundred individuals for millennia. Importantly, the study detected that the most harmful mutations had been purged by natural selection, even as some milder mutations accumulated. In other words, genetics alone didn't seal their fate. The Wrangel mammoths were inbred, yes, but they had managed to overcome that hurdle and were likely not on an inevitable genetic death spiral. This means that while genetic deterioration might have made the population more vulnerable or less resilient, it likely wasn't the primary cause of extinction. Another practical factor to consider is the availability of fresh water. Large mammals need a lot of drinking water, and on small islands, droughts or changes in water sources can be catastrophic. A dramatic example of this comes from St. Paul Island, in what is now Alaska's Bering Sea. St. Paul was another island where mammoths hung on after the Ice Age, though not as long as on Wrangel. The St. Paul mammoths died out about 5,600 years ago, and scientists have found evidence that a drought caused their only lake to dry up. In essence, those mammoths, surrounded by an endless body of water, died of thirst when fresh water became scarce. This finding raises the question, could something similar have happened on Wrangel Island? Wrangel is much larger than St. Paul, and likely had multiple streams or tundra ponds fed by snowmelt. At present, the idea is just a hypothesis, but it's possible it may have been a contributing factor. With human hunting and gradual climate or genetic decline looking less likely, many scientists now suspect that a sudden catastrophic event delivered the final blow to Wrangel's mammoths. The genetic study published in 2024 concluded that the population was stable right up until the end, implying that something happened quickly to wipe them out. What could strike an entire herd of hundreds of animals so abruptly? Two possibilities stand out: disease or extreme weather. If a new infectious disease arrived, perhaps carried by birds, it could have swept through a population with low immune diversity. In fact, researchers noted that the Wrangel mammoths had unusually low variation in genes related to immune response. This could mean they were especially vulnerable to a virulent pathogen, having fewer genetic tools to fight off a plague. A sudden epidemic, even one that might only cause mild illness in a more diverse population, might have raced through the herd unchecked, leading to a mass die-off in a short time. Unfortunately, diseases leave little trace in the fossil record, so this theory is hard to prove or disprove directly. The other possibility is an extreme weather disaster, as mentioned earlier, something like an unprecedented blizzard, ice storm, or a summer failure of plant growth. For instance, a once-in-10,000-year winter storm could have covered the island in ice or snow, deep enough that mammoths couldn't find any food. It's important to note that these theories aren't mutually exclusive. In reality, the extinction of the Wrangel Island mammoths may have been the result of several factors combining to push the animals past a tipping point. Perhaps the climate had gradually made life harder, weakening the herd's overall health. The limited genetic diversity might have reduced their ability to adapt or fight off illness. Then, finally, an acute disaster like a disease outbreak or severe weather event struck a population that, while stable on the surface, didn't have much resilience to spare. In the end, what is clear is that the mammoths disappeared relatively suddenly, not long after 4,000 years ago, so any ultimate cause had to operate on a short time scale. On June 16, 1987, A horrific scene unfolded in a Toledo, Ohio neighborhood just off Interstate 75. In the early morning hours, a passing driver spotted flames in an alley behind a closed auto repair shop. Investigating further, he came upon a burning body. The victim was a young woman who had been wrapped in a blanket with a blue plastic bag over her head and deliberately set on fire. Firefighters were called to extinguish her smoldering remains. The woman had no identification on her, and any distinguishing features were partially obscured by the flames. Authorities determined that the victim had likely died a day or two before her body was dumped and burned. The location, an alley near Collingwood Boulevard and I-75 in Lucas County, suggested that someone had gone to great lengths to hide the body. From the beginning, investigators treated the case as a probable slaying or cover-up, given the extreme measures taken to destroy evidence. In the aftermath of the discovery, detectives with the Toledo Police and the Lucas County Coroner's Office gathered what details they could about the Jane Doe. Despite the damage from the fire, an autopsy and crime scene examination yielded several clues about the victim. She was a white female, estimated to be in her late teens or early 20s, and she stood approximately 5 feet 4 inches to 5 feet 7 inches tall and weighing around 110 pounds. She had short hair described as strawberry blonde or light brown. Not much clothing survived the fire, but investigators noted she was wearing Jordache brand jeans, a popular brand of the 1980s. She also had 5 small, round pearl stud earrings in each ear, and her toenails were painted pink. These personal details suggested she took care in her appearance, at least to some degree. The coroner observed significant tooth decay, implying she had received little or poor dental care in life. This detail hinted at socioeconomic factors or lifestyle choices. However, it was unclear whether this decay was the result of recent dental neglect, the result of recent substance use, or the result of a lifetime of minimal dental intervention. Investigators also compared her case against numerous missing person reports. They even considered missing teens from other cities, including the Cleveland area, suspecting she might have traveled or been brought from elsewhere. To enlist the public's help, authorities turned to forensic artists. The Michigan State Police assisted by creating a clay facial reconstruction of the Jane Doe's face, attempting to recreate her likeness in life. I've put this clay reconstruction on the screen now for those of you who just listen, and to be honest, I can see why the authorities moved away from using these models. That said, the hope was that someone would recognize the face or the description and come forward with a name. Over the years, several leads trickled in, but none panned out, and the victim's unique details didn't trigger any definitive recognition. By the 1990s and 2000s, the case had gone cold, and in official records, she was often referred to as the Lucas County Jane Doe. Despite periodic reviews of the case, for 37 years the young woman's identity and the story of how she ended up in that alley remained a haunting mystery. From the outset, investigators faced a troubling question. Was this young woman the victim of a crime, or was her death the result of a tragic accident that someone tried to cover up? The autopsy results deepened the intrigue. The Lucas County coroner found no bullet wounds, stab injuries, or blunt force trauma on the remains. Instead, they discovered evidence of a fatal coke overdose, which was determined to be the cause of death. In other words, she likely died from coke before her body was set ablaze. There were no other signs of violence on her body aside from the post-mortem burning. But this immediately led to a follow-up question. If she had simply overdosed, why the gruesome attempt to destroy her remains? This led police to suspect that those who were with her when she died panicked and attempted to hide her identity and the circumstances of her death. It was theorized that she may have overdosed at a different location, possibly in a trap house or at a party. Whoever was responsible for her or present at her death chose to dispose of her body in a remote spot in Toledo, setting it on fire to eliminate the evidence. The burning of the body suggested fear or guilt on the part of the perpetrators, as if they were desperate to ensure she could not be recognized or tied back to them. For decades, the cover-up or slaying question hung over the case. On paper, the coroner had ruled the death an overdose, with the manner of death officially undetermined due to the unusual aftermath. Yet, investigators and the public alike wondered if the overdose might have been forced, or if other foul play was involved. The fire had destroyed so much physical evidence that it was impossible to know if, for example, she had been restrained or assaulted prior to death. Every theory about what happened to this young woman was hampered by the fact that no one knew who she was. Without an identity, police couldn't easily trace her last steps or the people she was associating with at the time. But it turned out that this mystery perhaps wasn't as far out of reach as investigators in the 1980s believed. It turns out that this Jane Doe was none other than Tammy Lowe, and what I'm going to tell you next adds another layer to this nightmare. In fact, it turned out that Tammy Lowe had been reported missing, but due to a clerical or investigative mishap, those reports never made it into national databases. Family members later revealed that Tammy's grandmother tried twice in 1987 to file missing person reports for her in the Detroit area. However, police at the time failed to officially enter her as a missing person. This heartbreaking lapse meant that for all those years, when authorities searched for a missing girl matching the Jane Doe, Tammy's name never appeared. She had unfortunately completely slipped through the cracks of the system, her family's pleas unheard. By the early 2020s, a new tool was changing the landscape of cold case investigations: investigative genetic genealogy. This technique involves analyzing DNA from an unidentified person and comparing it to profiles uploaded in databases in order to find relatives. It had been used to solve several high-profile cold cases, and in 2024, the Toledo Police Department decided it was time to apply this method to the long-standing Jane Doe case. The work was carried out by Othram, a Texas-based forensic laboratory specializing in solving cold cases through this method. Othram's scientists extracted a comprehensive DNA profile from the decades-old remains, a challenging task given the damage from the fire and passage of time. Using that DNA profile, they scoured genealogical databases for any relatives of the unknown woman. By early 2025, the DNA search yielded a promising lead: a possible relative living in Michigan. Detectives from Ohio teamed up with the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation and local authorities in Michigan to investigate this lead. They identified family members of a young woman who had vanished from the Detroit area in 1987, and the pieces were starting to come together rapidly. In February 2025, a close relative provided a DNA sample to compare against the Jane Doe. After a few anxious weeks of waiting, the results arrived. On March 20th, 2025, nearly 38 years after the body was found, the Jane Doe was formally identified as Tammy Dale Lowe, an 18-year-old from Taylor, Michigan. When the news broke, Tammy's family was both relieved and devastated. They had spent decades wondering what happened to the bright teen who disappeared in 1987. Now they had confirmation of her fate, though the details were painful. Tammy Lowe had just graduated high school and turned 18 when she went missing in early June 1987. She had fallen into substance use, and the last time she was seen alive was at a house in Detroit where, according to family accounts, she may have been given substances against her will. Her family reported her missing, but as noted, the case wasn't taken seriously at the time by authorities. With Tammy Lowe's identity confirmed, the investigation shifted focus. Detectives hoped to piece together how she ended up where she did and who was responsible for the gruesome disposal of her body. The circumstances of her death remain an unsolved mystery, despite the identification. What investigators don't know is whether that overdose was accidental or deliberately inflicted, and who was present when she died. Given that Tammy was last seen in Metro Detroit, one theory is that she overdosed there, and that individuals transported her body over the Ohio state line to Toledo to dump her. This would explain why a Michigan teenager's remains showed up in Ohio. However, without witnesses or further evidence, this theory remains unproven. What is clear is that someone took great pains to erase Tammy's identity, wrapping her in a carpet and tarp, covering her face with plastic, and setting her on fire in an isolated spot. Whether their motive was to cover up a crime or simply a panicked attempt to hide a tragic accident, those responsible have never been held accountable. Now that Tammy's name is known, investigators have new avenues to pursue. They can interview her relatives and anyone who knew her back in 1987 to build a timeline of her final days. They can also re-examine the evidence with fresh eyes, armed with the knowledge of who she was and where she came from. Given how recently her case was partially solved, I hope to have an update on Tammy Lowe's story in a future episode. In the middle of a Russian swampland near St. Petersburg stands a rusting radio tower behind an iron gate. This is the supposed headquarters of a mysterious radio station that no authority has ever openly claimed. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, this station broadcasts an incessant, monotonous buzz on the shortwave frequency 4025 kilohertz. Every few seconds, the monotone is joined by a second sound, often likened to a ghostly ship's foghorn, and then the droning buzz continues. Occasionally, the foghorn-like drone stops, and a voice cuts through the static. A man or woman comes on, speaking brief words or numbers in Russian, before the buzz continues. This eerie broadcast has persisted for decades, captivating shortwave listeners around the world. It's known by the codename UVB-76, nicknamed the Buzzer. To this day, its true purpose remains officially unconfirmed, making it one of the most enduring mysteries in radio broadcasting. UVB-76 is widely believed to be a type of numbers station, part of a secretive tradition of radio broadcasting that dates back to the early 20th century. Numbers stations are shortwave radio transmitters that send out coded messages, often in the form of spoken numbers or Morse code. They're believed to be destined for intelligence agents in the field. During the Cold War, such stations became prolific as a high-security, low-risk method for governments to communicate with spies or military units over vast distances. Shortwave signals can travel thousands of miles by bouncing off the ionosphere, which made them ideal for reaching operatives across borders. Crucially, anyone with a shortwave receiver can hear a numbers station, but only those with the secret decryption key, typically a one-time pad, can decipher its true message. This one-way broadcast method is virtually untraceable to the recipient. An agent can receive orders in complete anonymity, since there is no way to prove who is merely listening to a radio signal. Among all known numbers stations, UVB-76, the Buzzer, stands out for its unique and relentless broadcast. Its origins date back to the late Soviet era. The station was first noticed by listeners in the late 1970s, and by 1982, the strange buzzing on 4625 kilohertz had been recorded. Throughout the 1980s, the signal reportedly consisted of short, high-pitched beeps, one every couple of seconds. By the early 1990s, this pattern evolved into the signature buzz that gave the station its nickname. The buzz is a repeating tone that sounds 20 to 30 times per minute, essentially round the clock. The purpose of this incessant noise, according to radio experts, is likely to act as a channel marker, an audible flag that tells other radio users the frequency is occupied and active. In practical terms, the buzzing assures those listening on the channel that the station is functioning. On old analog receivers, the distinctive tone also makes tuning in easier, and if the sound stops unexpectedly, it could trigger alarms on monitoring equipment. In short, the buzz itself may carry no hidden message, but rather it simply keeps the communication line open and ready. What truly deepened the mystery of UVB-76 were the rare moments when the buzzing stopped. From 1987 to 1997, no voice transmissions were documented on the channel. Then, on December 24th, 1997, listeners heard a live voice break the silence. The voice read out a coded message in Russian phonetic alphabet, including the call sign UVB-76, repeated several times. This marked the first time the mysterious station identified itself. After that, years might pass between voice messages, but they did recur unpredictably. A typical message might consist of a short identifier, like a call sign, followed by a sequence of numbers or a list of Russian names and words. One such transmission in 2013, for instance, announced in Russian, Command 135 issued, as part of an encoded military-style message. These messages are spoken in a flat, controlled tone, and are believed by experts to likely be live rather than pre-recorded. To an ordinary listener, they are almost indecipherable as they're just a string of code words and numbers. Yet to whoever is meant to hear it, that single minute of speech amid the endless buzz could convey something of great importance. Over time, UVB-76 has undergone notable changes in both form and apparent location. For more than 3 decades of the Cold War and its aftermath, the station transmitted from a site near Povarovo, a small town about 40 kilometers from Moscow. This was the location of a Soviet-era communications hub, and after the Soviet Union's collapse, the station kept running at this facility under Russian Army oversight. In those years, the station's operations were shrouded in secrecy. However, in 2010, a series of dramatic events pulled the buzzer further into the spotlight. In early June 2010, for the first time in memory, the buzzer stopped transmitting for about 24 hours. A few weeks later, in August 2010, the normally regular signal began to cut in and out, and on August 25th, curious sounds were heard in the background. These noises sounded like people moving furniture or equipment in a room. There were snippets of Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake music quietly playing in the background, adding to the atmosphere of the moment. It was as if someone was physically present at the transmission site, tinkering with the equipment while inadvertently broadcasting ambient noises. Then, on September 7th, 2010, at 8:48 p.m. Moscow time, UVB-76 suddenly issued a new voice message. A male voice spoke the code Mikhail Dmitry Genya Boris, which listeners recognized as a new call sign. The message continued with numbers and Russian words, indicating that the station had not only changed its identifier, but possibly its role or location. Indeed, soon after this event, signal triangulation indicated that the buzzer had moved. No longer was it emanating from the Povarovo base. It appeared to be coming from a site near St. Petersburg in northwest Russia. Later, as Russia's military reorganized its command structure, the station likely moved again, though the current whereabouts are unconfirmed. Why does UVB-76 exist at all, and what is the purpose behind this endless broadcast of buzzes and occasional codes? The most prominent theory is that the buzzer is an espionage tool, essentially a classic numbers station transmitting messages to spies. This idea is appealing given the station's mysterious nature and the historical use of shortwave radio by intelligence agencies. Could those rare voice messages be orders to sleeper agents embedded abroad? This is often where the analysis stops, but actually there's much more to the story than this. However, many experts doubt that UVB-76's primary role is spycraft in the traditional sense. Unlike typical number stations that broadcast easily recognizable number groups at scheduled times, the buzzer's messages come at unpredictable intervals. Moreover, analyses suggest its transmitter power is not especially high for long-range global broadcasts. These factors lead some to conclude that this broadcast might not be optimal for covertly reaching agents worldwide. In other words, while espionage cannot be ruled out, UVB-76 doesn't fit the mold of a classic number station in some respects. Another widely supported theory is that UVB-76 serves as a military communications channel for the Russian armed forces in the former Soviet sphere of influence. This may explain why the broadcast is underpowered compared to a traditional number station. Notably, some Baltic officials, who were once an integral part of the Soviet Union, have indicated that this is what they believe it is. That said, no one with direct knowledge of the buzzer has ever come forward, and all the evidence has been secondhand, or worse. Perhaps the most ominous theory, one that has captured public imagination, is that UVB-76 is a component of a dead man's switch in Russia's nuclear defense apparatus. Specifically, some have linked it to the legendary Soviet perimeter system. This system, which was designed during the Cold War, allowed the Soviet Union to automatically retaliate with nuclear missiles if the USSR's leadership were wiped out. According to this hypothesis, the buzzer's tone is effectively a signal that says, "All is well." If it were to fall silent due to a devastating strike, the silence itself would trigger perimeter to launch a counterstrike without human input. It's a particularly chilling idea, since this seemingly innocuous buzz could be the sound of doomsday on hold. However, experts are quick to point out serious flaws in the dead hand speculation. For one, UVB-76 has had numerous unplanned outages and interruptions over the years, which suggests it's not an infallible fail-safe signal. If global nuclear war hung in the balance of the buzzer never skipping a beat, it's unlikely it would be allowed to sputter as often as it historically has. Thus, while the dead hand theory is compelling as a mystery trope, most analysts consider it very unlikely in reality. On April 21, 1918, Manfred von Richthofen, the famed Red Baron of Germany, with a record-breaking 80 aerial victories, took off in his bright red triplane along with several squadron mates. The events of this day would spark a historical debate, which has continued on for more than a century. Over the Somme Valley in France, they engaged a patrol of British Royal Air Force Sopwith camels. During the dogfight, one camel piloted by Lieutenant Wilfred May broke away, and the Baron gave chase at low altitude deep into Allied territory. Roy Brown, a Canadian pilot flying a Sopwith camel, dived steeply from above to help his comrade. At the same time, Allied ground troops in the trenches below also opened fire with their machine guns and rifles as the low-flying red triplane passed over. Amid the bursts of gunfire from both Brown's aircraft and multiple Australian units on the ground, the Red Baron's luck finally ran out. His triplane abruptly descended and crash-landed in a field, ending the aerial ace, just a few days shy of his 26th birthday. The Red Baron had broken one of his own tactical rules by flying low and fast over enemy lines, a risky maneuver that put him within range of ground fire. His death was a significant propaganda coup for the Allies, but almost immediately a debate began. Who fired the bullet that ultimately felled history's most famous fighter ace? Captain Roy Brown of Canada was the pilot who engaged Manfred von Richthofen from the air, and he was officially credited with shooting down the Red Baron in the immediate aftermath of the battle. Brown reported that he dove on the red triplane from behind while it was targeting Lieutenant May, and he fired a long and consistent burst at close range. According to Brown's combat report, the triplane went into a steep dive and crashed after his attack. Lieutenant May later affirmed that he saw Richthoven's plane go down and was completely convinced that Brown must have been the one who hit the Baron. In recognition of Brown's daring interception of Richthoven, a formal RAF Board of Inquiry credited Brown with the victory. This, of course, made him an instant hero as the man who vanquished the Red Baron. Brown's claim went largely unquestioned by the RAF at the time, and he received much public acclaim. In fact, the British had strong motivation to credit an airman. Manfred von Richthofen had long been the most coveted target, and the RAF had even offered rewards and an automatic Victoria Cross to any pilot who could defeat him. Brown himself was modest about the achievement, but officially he went down in history as the victor over the Red Baron. However, from the very start, there were dissenting voices and conflicting eyewitness accounts that suggested Brown might not have fired the shot. Almost as soon as Richthoven's triplane hit the ground, Australian ground troops on the scene asserted that their fire had brought him down, not Roy Brown. Several machine gun posts of the Australian Imperial Force were stationed along Richthoven's flight path near Moreland Court Ridge, and they had engaged the low-flying red triplane. Multiple soldiers claimed credit, but through the years, only one has been found to have any serious claim. This claimant was Sergeant Cedric Popkin, an anti-aircraft Vickers machine gunner of the 24th Machine Gun Company, who fired at the triplane from the ground. Popkin later recounted that he fired 2 bursts at the Red Baron, first as it approached his position, and a second time as it banked and flew away, presenting its side and back to him. It was during this second burst, as von Richthoven began turning away, that Popkin likely scored a hit. In a letter to Australia's official war historian, Popkin described tracking the red plane through a 180-degree turn and firing at it until it rolled and crashed. The angle of Popkin's fire, from the Baron's right side and slightly to the rear, matches well with the wound the Baron sustained. Australian witnesses on the ground noted that the red triplane's flight became erratic after Popkin's bursts, veering and almost stalling before crash landing. They took this as evidence that ground fire had mortally wounded the pilot. Central to unraveling the mystery is the forensic evidence from von Richthoven's wounds and the trajectory of the bullet. Allied medical officers conducted an autopsy on the fallen airman on the day of his death. They found that von Richthofen had been slain by a single bullet, which entered under his right armpit and traveled upward through his chest cavity before exiting near the left side of his chest. Notably, the same sort of ammo was used by all Allied weaponry at play on that day, so the ammo itself doesn't solve the problem. But to get back to the main point, in other words, the shot came from below and to the right of the Baron, coursing upward through his body. This trajectory is a crucial clue. If Captain Roy Brown had struck the Red Baron while diving from above and behind in his Sopwith Camel, the bullet path would be expected to travel downward into von Richthofen, not upward. Brown himself approached from the Baron's rear right at a higher altitude. It's difficult to reconcile Brown's attack angle with the wound's upward track, unless the Baron's plane was steeply banked at the exact moment Brown fired. Brown never mentioned such a steep bank in his combat report or later accounts. In fact, he described von Richthofen looking back at him during the chase, implying the triplane was roughly level. This casts significant doubt on whether Brown's bullets could have caused the wound. Another piece of evidence is the timing of von Richthofen's final actions. If Brown's burst had hit the Baron squarely through the chest, piercing his heart or lungs, von Richthofen would likely have lost consciousness almost instantly. he would have been unable to continue a controlled chase for as long as he did. Medical experts note that a wound through the heart or major vessels would have incapacitated the pilot within 20 seconds at most. This suggests that Brown's fire did not immediately end the Baron, and that the mortal wound was inflicted at the very end of the pursuit. That timeline better fits the accounts of the Australian gunners, who fired on the triplane just before it went into its fatal dive. The ballistic trajectory evidence aligns most neatly with Sergeant Popkin's firing position. Popkin's second burst was aimed at von Richthofen's right side as the triplane was turning away, which means his Vickers machine gun was shooting upward relative to the plane. That corresponds to the upward bullet path found in the body. That said, in theory, an unknown infantry rifleman on the ground could also have fired the shot from Richthofen's right flank. Several riflemen did take shots at the red plane as it passed overhead. This unknown soldier theory cannot be entirely dismissed, as any Lee Enfield firing the same sort of ammo could have caused the same wound if the timing and angle were just right. However, no specific rifleman ever came forward with convincing evidence, and the volume of machine gun fire makes it more likely a machine gunner hit the target. Given all the available data, most historians and forensic experts conclude that the shot almost certainly came from the ground, not from Roy Brown's camel. Popkin, being in the best position and having an optimal angle of fire, remains by far the top contender in the analysis of von Richthofen's demise. It's worth noting that the initial autopsy report back in 1918 didn't reach the same conclusion. The British surgeons who examined Manfred von Richthofen's body right after the crash believed that the bullet's angle was too steep to have come from ground fire. This led them to attribute the wound to Brown's attack from the air. This early assessment was accepted officially at the time, which is why Brown was credited. In hindsight, many historians consider that autopsy finding to be flawed, or at least incomplete. Others suspect that the findings of the British medical team at the time may not have been truly independent or fact-based. The idea that the Red Baron was shot down by ground-based soldiers likely wouldn't have had a similar propaganda effect as the greatest German aerial ace being bested by the RAF. Further, the Germans could have lessened the morale blow to their populace by claiming that the Red Baron hadn't really been felled in honorable aerial combat. Officially, the victory is still attributed to Roy Brown, despite significant evidence to the contrary. That said, even though it appears that Brown and the RAF didn't actually land the final blow, this isn't to diminish their role in the event. To the contrary, without Brown and company essentially putting the Red Baron in a checkmate position, Popkin or an unknown rifleman would have never had the opportunity they were presented.